This video relates to preliminary engineering studies or year 11 HSC engineering studies, and we're in chapter 2 and we're learning about household objects, specifically relevant to the syllabus dot points. We're looking at the historical and societal influences of engineering, in this case of engineering products or engineered products. We're going to look at the historical development of some engineered products, and you're going to recount those. We're going to learn about the effects of engineering products on people's lives and how it's affected the standards of living. And we're going to look at these, the environmental impacts. So to sum those three things up, just in short terms, we're going to look at the history of some products. We're going to look at the effect on people's lives, and we're going to look at the environmental impact of those products. The words recount, describe, and identify are slightly different. So in terms of the HSC, identify just means name or list. If I say identify 3 students, I might say Marcus, Max, and Aiden. That would be identifying 3 students. If I was to describe them, I would say, well, these are the 3 students. They all like KFC, right? And that would be a property that I'm describing about those students. I might say one of them does, he streams Formula 1 racing, as an example. In terms of, so it's the difference between identify and describe. Recount is not a commonly used HSC verb, so I'm not totally off. I'm not sure I can quickly think of that. I would use something like outline instead of recount if I was writing a question. And that just means identify, say, 4 or 5 points, maybe give some sort of setting. It doesn't need to be a date. It could be a person that establishes setting. So if you could say, for instance, the first mass-produced car was developed by Henry Ford, was the Model T developed by Henry Ford. Henry Ford identifies a time period. You don't need to know the year as long as you can tell me the person. Or if you could say that the steam engine was developed in the Second Industrial Revolution, or it was what kicked off the Second Industrial Revolution, that sets a time period. If we're talking about the steam pump, that's what was in the First Industrial Revolution, and that's even if you just said Industrial Revolution, personally I'm okay with that. Okay, so now we've moved on from that. We're going to talk a little bit about there's the Copeland textbook, which I have covered previously, and I've already summarized to these students. I have another video that talks about this. I go through, there's about 6 lawnmowers and about 6 cars. Off the top of my head, I would say, like, if I had to recount the history of lawnmowers, I would say that prior to the use of lawnmowers, grass was cut with a scythe or a sickle or some other just manual sharp blade. Whereas, or as goats might have been how you dealt with grasses. Though the first lawnmower was developed in 1830, it was the Ferriby push mower, and then it was later further developed by 1900. The cast iron push mower was replaced with steel, which was lighter and sharper. By 1936, we have the Royal, the first petrol engine. Then in the 50s and 60s, they further developed petrol engines. They had catches, polymer catches, that became, so in the 50s, they had difficult starter motors. By the time, by the 60s, they had impulse starter motors. That was easier to start the petrol engine. They had better catches. And then they continued to develop up until 4-stroke engines, which we start to see with Hondas and things into the 2000s. That would be my summary of, that would be me recounting the history of the lawnmower. In the case of the car, I would say that the Benz pattern motor wagon was the first car to travel a long distance, with Bertha Benz driving 200 kilometers or so, more than 100 kilometers. Then the Model T was the first mass-produced car, made possible, drastically cheaper, made possible by the production line. Pre-war Germany developed the Volkswagen, which went on to be the most successful car of its time, selling more than 21 million vehicles. These days, I'll keep going. The Citroën DS offered drastically improved ride comfort. And then I might jump to the Range Rover being the first 4-wheel drive. And then I might say these days that the most widely sold car is the Toyota Corolla. That's a summary. I've recounted the history of those 2 innovations. In this case, what we're going to look at quickly here is we're going to go through some other notes. These, I have 2 lots of Metcalfe notes. This is the Metcalfe and Metcalfe, the Metcalfe brothers notes. and they describe some household appliances. They describe the iron. I've already played my Iron Butterfly, the Iron Butterfly song, but the iron, I'm of the opinion that the iron was a mistake and that we as a society are worse off for having had the iron. But we will have a quick look at the history of the iron here. And then following on from the iron, we have the stove. So the stove here. And then moving on from the stove, we then have the refrigerator, the development of the refrigerator, and what else do we have? Yep, okay. So then we have 3 household appliances. Now, I am not going to go into these in great detail because these notes are relatively good, and the homework is for you to pick one of those 3 and summarize it. I'm not expecting many words. I think I said 200, maybe 300 words, something along those lines. What I say, 300 words. So, before I go into those ones, the reason why I think the iron is a mistake, just before I forget, the idea is that before the iron was invented, right, this is a case of game theory where the prisoner's dilemma was someone has gone along and ruined it for everybody. If everybody didn't iron their clothes, there would be no expectation to iron your clothes. But because some jerk said, you know what, I'm going to look really sharp, I'm going to be so dapper, I'm going to iron my clothes, and everyone's going to go, wow, that shirt looks amazing. And then it ruined it for everyone. Now everyone has to iron their shirts. So everyone loses like half an hour to an hour of their week every week having to iron clothes. Okay, so I will say that David Mitchell, he has a video on YouTube where he extends this to say that men should wear tuxedos to the Oscars, black tuxedos to the Oscars. For, you know, people like John Legend or, I don't know, fancy, well-dressed men, stop doing it. You're ruining it for everyone. Obviously, it's already a terrible situation for women. Don't ruin it for men. We've got a good thing. We're on a good thing. Just wear a black tuxedo to the Oscars. That is my, thank you for listening to my TED Talk. Okay, so moving on. The iron. Oh, what a mistake. Okay, so, you know, I've decided I'm not even going to go into the iron. And I'm saying that on the record. You can read this document. It's going to be attached as a PDF. And I'm not going to hurt Metcalf and Metcalf's book sales by scrolling through it slowly. What I'm instead going to do is I'm going to talk to you about instead the kettle, right? Because the kettle is an objectively good thing. So once upon a time, if you wanted to drink water, well, you went down the watering hole. I think an interesting take on this is in the start of the movie 2001, where one group of pre-human monkeys, that's probably not the correct term, but I'm going to call them, maybe they're just the start of human, they look like monkeys. Anyway, they fight another family of monkeys so that they can drink from the water hole. And they go up and they drink from the water hole, and the water is brown. And I'm like, oh man, once upon a time, people drank from brown rivers. And then I think, there are still people who drink from brown rivers. Whenever my brother complains to me about housing prices, I say, you know there are people who are drinking out of the Ganges right now. The Ganges is a river in India. And he's like, that doesn't make me feel better, Luke. But, you know, you can only try. The point is, though, that boiling water is a great way to kill pathogens, to kill the germs in your water. So, to boil water, you need some way of holding water. If you just try and boil water in your hands, doesn't end well, right? So do not recommend. Instead, you need something to hold the water so that you can heat it up high enough. So for a long enough time, cast iron, so we have casting, so bronze pots, for instance, they've existed for a long time. Bronze casting has existed for thousands of years. But eventually, the big spike, the thing that's kicked off the First Industrial Revolution, is in addition to the steam pump, is cast iron. A guy called Abraham Darby figured out that he could produce about 8 pots in a day compared to his competitors who would take about a week to make 1 pot. So effectively, if he was working a six-day week, he was producing about 50 times as much as his competitors. It's pretty amazing. Drastically reduce the cost of that household good. So now suddenly people could boil their water to kill the pathogens. There's even a distinction between the East and West in civilization in the terms that Asia, they were more able to boil water earlier in their cultural history compared to Europe, the Western civilization. The West, how they dealt with the poisons in their water is they drank a lot more alcohol. And this is why Westerners, so Europeans, typically can metabolize alcohol better than some Asian people from Asian backgrounds, because they just have a longer history of metabolizing alcohol, and alcohol kills germs. So being able to boil water has this huge advantage in sanitation. Suddenly you get clean water. Also makes it more pleasant to bathe in. If you can, if you can have a bath in warm water. I'm okay with cold showers, but you do kill more germs if you wash your hands in hot water than if you do in cold water. There's also society. Okay, so in terms of that's the history of the. I mean, I haven't even started on the history of the kettle. If we start on, okay, so we might say bronze pots were available, then cast pots were very, very cheap. Well, relatively speaking, they'd be expensive by today's standards. And then electrification. So when Edison started to electrify, first he started with lights, and that was then extended to heating. So people were able to boil water on electric stoves. And then eventually electric kettles, which had a greater degree of safety. There's difference, so things like there's a TV show called Electric Dreams, which I might find a link to, where in one episode, an English family that they go through the innovations of different decades, and one of the things they get is a tea maid that allows them to have something that makes your tea for you in the morning. It sets to a timer, and you just pour just enough water for 2 cups of tea, and at 6 o'clock in the morning it starts boiling the tea so that just quietly it's ready to have a warm cup of tea at 6:30 when you get up, so you don't have to walk down to the cold kitchen of your English winter. That's another development, but we had things like the whistling teapot, which led to eventually electric shutoffs. So we had bimetal strips. So bimetal strips is where you have 2 different kinds of metal, and one expands faster than the other. So when the 2 metals heat up, they bend like a banana, and eventually they disconnect the electricity. So that way the water doesn't boil forever. It switches itself off, which is a safety advantage. Then you can look at things like induction stoves. So cultural differences. In the United States, you can't really buy plug-in kettles. As my understanding that a mate of mine who lived there, he said the things he noticed in America, the first things he noticed were that the light switches go the wrong way, and that most people he knew, they would either have a kettle that you put on the stove, or they would just boil a cup in a microwave, which was a far more common thing. He said the idea of having a plastic kettle was pretty uncommon. Also, an interesting point that I like to talk about in terms of the kettle is I like to think about things like the Opium War was a war between China and England, where England wanted to buy the tea from China, and they said, we'll pay you in silver. And China said, you know what, we've got enough silver, thanks but no thanks. And China said, okay, in that case, we're going to sell you opium, opium being a drug like heroin. And China's like, nah, no thanks. And China's like, oh, well, here's my battleship. And they started bombing ports until they were allowed to sell opium. And it did not end well for the Chinese. And that now shapes modern Chinese economic policy. The memory of the Opium War is still a thing that influences Chinese decision makers today. So that's my run through of a. Let's go through and let's see that I've identified the various points here. The historical development of the kettle. Well, kettles were originally made out of cast copper or bronze, copper alloys like bronze. Then the widespread availability of cast iron pots during the Industrial Revolution drastically decreased the cost of boiling water. This led to eventually this was developed eventually by electric kettles, and then we have advantages like bimetal strips, which have kettles which switch themselves off, improving their safety. That's 4. I've just identified 4 steps in the history of the kettle. The effects of people's lives. I've talked about the health benefits of clean drinking, or boiling water to give yourself clean drinking water. But also we mentioned things like just the comfort benefits of hot water, of the sanitation of being able to wash your hands in hot water, but also bathing in hot water is just more pleasant. In terms of environmental implications, I did not talk about this. Well, producing heat is one of the biggest causes of, one of the biggest demands of electricity, or any sort of form of heating, any form of chemical transfer change of energy. So it doesn't matter if you're burning wood to boil kettle, that's bad, because wood is, we now find we chopped down a lot of forest to boil water. We then started switching to things like coal. We now use that coal to power plants. Power plants to boiling water is a relatively high energy task. This is where if you're taking an hour-long shower, you really are taking a hit on the environment. You kind of lose a few of your environmentalist brownie points if you're taking an hour-long shower, because heating water is really not great for the environment. I listened to a podcast, Factually, with Adam Conover in the last week, where it talked about how we could pretty much address, it was an Australian some prize winner, was saying that we could pretty much address climate change if we could just get everyone to drive electric vehicles, and if we could get everyone to use electric heating instead of burning fuel for both of those things. And in the case of boiling water, that's a consideration. So using electricity to boil water is obviously an environmental impact. The other thing that's worth considering is very few people are going to recycle their kettles. If your kettle breaks, you throw it out. Right? These days, no one repairs things. An electric kettle has parts that can break, they degrade over time, and then they get thrown out. So that contributes to landfill, which is a problem. So that's my summary. Now, obviously, I spoke for well over 300 words there, but the point is I'm not expecting you to go into as much detail. I have this document here, which I spent a lot of time scanning, and it was probably wasteful. I could have scanned that later, but because I didn't end up going through it anyway. But you could pick, in this case here, we have 3 different examples with some pretty good sources. We have the iron, the stove, and the refrigerator, and you could use my example of the kettle. If you wanted, you could also use the lawnmower or the car, but I'm not saying that on the document. You have to listen to this to the end of my YouTube video to get to that point.